Hi everyone, it's Peter Schiff. It is Friday, August 24th, 2012. Well, this week, the Fed officially came that much closer to acknowledging something that I've been saying for a long time now, that QE3 is ready to launch. They didn't just come right out and say it, but they did about as close as they could without totally revealing their hand. First, we got the minutes from the last FOMC meeting, and I'll read just a little bit from those minutes. Quote, many members judge that additional monetary accommodation would likely be warranted fairly soon unless incoming information pointed to a substantial and sustainable strengthening in the pace of the economic recovery. Now, first of all, I don't know what fairly soon means, but it probably means pretty soon, like maybe before the election. And they said they're going to do it unless the economic data points to a substantial and sustainable strengthening in the recovery. Well, there's no chance that that's going to happen. We're not going to have a substantial or sustainable recovery. It's impossible. The irony of it is, as long as the Fed continues with its current monetary policy of holding interest rates artificially low, of printing money, buying government debt, of preventing the economy from restructuring, of preserving all the malinvestments that produced the booms, that made the bust necessary, that are responsible for the mess that we're in, as long as the Fed is doing this, there can't be a recovery, which means we're going to get QE3, which also means we're going to get QE4. Because if the Fed is going to do QE, if the economy doesn't recover, and if it can't recover because they're doing QE, well, then it never recovers and we keep getting it. Again, they just keep throwing gasoline on the fire, hoping that it goes out, but it never does because the gas makes the fire bigger, and now they're committed to more gasoline. As a result of this announcement from the Fed, you saw a spike in the price of gold and silver. In fact, prices started rising the day before the announcement, but this simply added to the rally. By the end of the week, the price of gold had moved up by about $50 an ounce. Silver was up almost $3 on the week. These are big moves. The metals are at levels they haven't seen since early May. Also, the dollar lost ground, not just against gold and silver, but against other fiat currencies. If you look at the dollar index, we moved down, I think, below 81.50. The chart looks pretty weak, so we got a weakening dollar, strengthening gold. Oil prices were also strong as a result of that announcement. Bond prices, which had been falling rather sharply, got a bit of a boost from the announcement of QE3. The reason being that QE3 means that the Fed is going to print money and buy bonds. Of course, when they buy those bonds, the price of bonds goes up, and so traders, anticipating this huge buyer coming into the market, want to buy treasuries now so that they can sell them to the Fed. Buy the rumor, sell the fact. Plus, bond prices had fallen substantially in the last several weeks as people began to doubt that there would have another round of quantitative easing. Now, I never doubted it. I know that we're going to have continuous QE because that's the only thing keeping this phony recovery going, although it's not even a recovery. In fact, we got some news out this week that shows that income, household income, has fallen more substantially during the recovery than it did during the recession. How can that be that the average American is worse off in the recovery than in the recession? You're telling me that the cure was worse than the disease? And if that's the case, right, we need the recession back. I mean, President Obama wants to claim that, he inherited a bad situation. Yeah, but he didn't have to make it worse. He's touting the recovery, but the reality is the recovery is worse than the recession, which means it's not a recovery. The recession is ongoing. It's getting worse. It's all because of these statistics that are all, stimulated. It's all phony. It's an illusion of recovery. But to the average American who's living through this recovery, it's worse than the recession. And imagine how much worse it's going to get when we're statistically back in recession again. The Fed knows it's coming, so that's why the Fed is doing QE3. It's just that the Fed can't admit that the economy is that addicted to cheap money because it doesn't want to let the cat out of the bag. It doesn't want people to realize the predicament that we're in because it cannot continue the QE indefinitely. We also got, I think today, we found out about a letter that Ben Bernanke wrote to House Oversight Committee Chairman Darrell Issa. If you remember, I testified in front of his subcommittee at one point. But this is a letter dated August 22nd, and this is what Chairman Bernanke wrote in that letter. I'm going to quote that. He said, "There is scope for further action by the Federal Reserve to ease financial conditions and strengthen the recovery." Now, ease financial conditions. That means there's room to do QE3. He said, quote, because short-term interest rates are at historically low levels, additional monetary accommodation requires the use of non-traditional policy tools such as balance sheet actions or communications about the likely future course of policy. Balance sheet means print money, buy bonds, that's QE3, and by communication, he's referring to the Fed's commitment, not only that rates are low now, but to keep them low, for a longer period of time. Right now, I think the Fed's commitment goes through 2014. I don't know how much longer they're going to make it. Maybe just forever. Just come right out and say interest rates are never going to go up, right? But if you combine the Bernanke letter to Issa, the new Fed minutes, what can you conclude other than QE3 is coming and is coming soon? And that's not good news. I mean, maybe it's good news if you're buying gold, but it's not good news if you're an American citizen. It's not going to reinvigorate the economy any more than QE2 did or QE1. Sure, we goosed the stock market. We enabled the government to spend a lot more money and go much deeper into debt, but how did that solve our problem? In fact, that made the problem worse. In fact, if you read that letter that Bernanke wrote, he includes a lot of language about how much he believes the Fed's actions have already helped the economy, that keeping interest rates low and buying government bonds has aided the recovery. I say it's prevented a recovery. Yes, we've got the artificial phony recovery in which household incomes are falling, not rising, right? In which nobody can find a job, and the only thing we have is more debt. That phony recovery, yeah, he helped that, but he's prevented a sustainable recovery from gaining any traction. Because before we can do that, we need to restructure the economy. Or better yet, we need to let the market restructure it. We need to rebuild a solid foundation from which we can grow, which means we need a smaller government, but that's not happening. Because the government is buying all these bonds, we've got a bigger government. And so our problems get bigger because the burden that the government places on the economy gets bigger. We need to save more. We need to invest more. We need to produce more. But none of this is happening because the Fed is standing in the way. So rather than engendering a recovery, their action has prevented a recovery. And if they're going to do more of it, it's simply going to delay further out into the future the point that we can actually have a recovery. Because we can't recover until the Fed understands that its policies are part of the problem. In fact, its policies are the problem. It's why the economy is so bad. It's why we had these bubbles. It's why they burst. And so until we change course, nothing is going to change. Nothing is going to improve. We keep pouring gasoline on the fire until the whole country is up in flames. Ultimately, the only thing that's going to put out that fire is going to be a return to the gold standard, which, as it so happens, is exactly what the Republicans are now considering because they have put it in their platform. They're going to be having their national convention down in Florida next week, and they do have as part of their official platform establishing a commission to look into a return to the gold standard. Now, of course, a lot of times commissions are just a show. They had a gold commission, I think under Ronald Reagan. It might have started with Jimmy Carter, but it really was rigged. The deck was stacked. The commission was full of a bunch of bankers, Wall Street guys, Fed guys, politicians, all who had a vested interest in preserving the status quo of the fiat system, and they didn't want a gold standard. So understandably, the commission came out against returning to a gold standard. There was, of course, a minority position. I believe Ron Paul actually authored that position, which wanted to go back on a gold standard. But of course, the commission wasn't doing what was good for the country. If they were, we would be on a gold standard right now. They were trying to preserve what was good for themselves and for the profits they were making as a result of this fiat system. Now, of course, the problems weren't as great back in 1980 as they are now. We hadn't been off the gold standard for as long a period. Remember, we went off it in 1971. So going back to it in 1980, we had only been off it for not even a full decade. And remember, when Nixon took us off the gold standard, he said it was only temporary. So if it was temporary, well, maybe we should have gone back to it. But, you know, in 1980, we were still the world's wealthiest creditor nation. We had big trade surpluses. We had a high savings rate. The fundamentals were sound. So it wasn't as important to go back. And a lot of people couldn't really understand how much damage had been done as a consequence of leaving the gold standard. But now, I mean, it's night and day. If you didn't know how bad it was in 1980, surely you know how bad it is now. The reason the economy is so screwed up, the reason we have so much debt, is because we went off the gold standard. You know, a lot of people are now talking about the gold standard because the Republicans have put it in their platform. And I was watching on CNBC, they had a guy on there that was saying it was complete nonsense or ludicrous. I forget all the words he was using, but he basically said it was a crazy idea. And he said that we had a good reason for going off the gold standard in 1971, so it would be dumb to go back on. Well, what was that good reason? He actually mentions what the good reason was. He says, and I'm reading this, I have it in an article, he says, because the deficits were so large, it didn't enable them to maintain it with the current supply of gold. So he says the good reason we had for going off the gold standard is we had big deficits. We didn't want to balance the budget. We wanted to continue to run deficits, and we couldn't do that and stay on a gold standard. So we went off the gold standard. That was the reason, so we could keep on deficit spending. That's not a good reason. I mean, maybe it was a good reason for the bureaucrats that wanted to promise something for nothing, but it wasn't a good economic reason. It wasn't a good reason for the country. It was a political expedient reason. But the fact of the matter is, had we not gone off the gold standard, then we would have had to cut the deficit. So if you like big deficits, if you think it's a good thing that we're trillions and trillions of dollars in debt, then maybe you think it was a good thing to go off the gold standard. But if you'd rather have an economy that was stable, if you'd rather not be mired in debt, well, then the gold standard was the way that would have prevented that. In fact, talking about how crazy it would be to go back on the gold standard, what was really crazy is that we abandoned it in the first place. You know, the founding fathers put us on a gold standard. Were they crazy? I don't think so. I think they were very learned, unlike the guys that are in Congress today. It's not like we just invented paper money. It's been around. The founding fathers were familiar with it. In fact, they had a bad taste in their mouths because they had lived through the Continental, which was a paper currency that was in circulation, which lost about 90% of its value. So the founding fathers knew firsthand the evils of paper money, and so they established gold and put us on a gold standard, a bimetallic standard with gold and silver, and the country prospered under a gold standard. I mean, look at the wealth that was created, the massive economic growth of the 19th century, the Industrial Revolution. All that happened under a gold standard. America became the wealthiest nation in the history of the world under a gold standard. We fought the Second World War under a gold standard. We became rich under a gold standard, and now we're broke because we abandoned it. We're now the world's biggest debtor nation. Our industry has disintegrated beneath our feet. The economy is a complete disaster. The record is clear. We prospered under a gold standard, and we've blown that prosperity. We squandered that wealth under a fiat standard. You know, in fact, I mentioned that the founding fathers put us on a gold standard. Well, the Constitution was never amended. We're still on a gold standard legally. If the federal government obeyed the Constitution, if the courts enforced the Constitution, Gold is still legal tender. States can make nothing but gold and silver coin, legal tender and payment of debts, and the only thing the federal government can do with respect to money is to make coins out of the gold and silver. That's it. That's what the Constitution says. That's what our founders wrote, and we should go back to that. The irony is, though, we're probably not going to go back to a gold standard because the politicians want it. We're going to go back to a gold standard because the public demands it, because that's what's going to happen in the aftermath of the currency crisis and the sovereign debt crisis that lies in our future. You know, a lot of countries, when they have a currency crisis, if they've had too much inflation, they end up tying their currency or pegging their currency to the dollar or maybe another currency that has international a standard or reputation to try to instill confidence, reinstill confidence in their currency. Well, we can't do that. I mean, when we have a dollar crisis, are we going to peg the dollar to the euro or the Japanese yen? That's not going to work. So the only thing we can return to is gold. The mistake that we made was leaving the gold standard in the first place. In fact, if you go back to the hearings that they held in Congress in 1968, when they were first considering abandoning the gold standard, right? My father was one of the only people who testified against removing the gold backing and who correctly predicted the events of the 1970s. My father said we'd have much higher inflation, the dollar would fall, the price of gold would rise. Of course, everybody else, the Secretary of the Treasury, the Chairman of the Federal Reserve, they had nothing but good things to say. They said if we get rid of the gold standard, we'll have a stronger economy, we'll have a stronger dollar. How these people thought a dollar backed by nothing would somehow be stronger than a dollar backed by something makes absolutely no sense. But again, it's the same type of nonsense that we're getting from our current Treasury Secretary and Fed Chairman. You know, they had a real decision to make back in 1971 when Nixon took the coward's way out. See, the problem was the government created a lot of inflation, particularly during the 1960s. If you remember the 1960s, you know, it was in all the history books, but that's when we had the guns and butter. We had the Vietnam War, we had the space race, we had the war on poverty. The government was spending money on everything, and so we were running these big deficits, although they were big by the standards back then. They were nothing compared to what we got now, but we were running these deficits. They were printing a lot of money, but we were still obligated to pay our creditors gold. You can still turn in your dollars. If you had $32, the government had to give you an ounce of gold. Well, since we were printing so much money and borrowing so much money, a lot of our creditors knew that we didn't have enough gold. In fact, the price of gold was the same in 1968 as it was in 1932, at $32. That's where that's where Roosevelt devalued to. Remember, before the Roosevelt first devaluation, the dollar was 20 ounces, $20 for an ounce of gold. He devalued to 32, and it was still at 32 in 1968 when they were doing these hearings. Now, the price of everything else, though, had gone up. I mean, the only thing you can still buy in 1968 at the 1932 price was an ounce of gold. I think the overall price level had probably tripled since then. So what did the government need to do to restore balance? Well, it really had two legitimate choices. One was to officially devalue the dollar, raise the price of gold up to where it needed to be, probably a little over $100 an ounce, and then the gold standard could have worked again. Of course, they would have also had to stop the deficit spending, which means they would have either had to raise taxes, cut government spending, or some combination of both. Alternatively, they could have maintained the value of the dollar, not devalued, and allowed deflation, allowed prices to adjust downward to the level of consistent with $32 an ounce gold, right? So deflation or devaluation. Those were the two choices. Of course, politicians hated those choices. They didn't want to do the responsible thing because the voters would have, they wouldn't have liked it. So they looked for an easy way out, the coward's way out, and Richard Nixon took it. Of course, they did try the devaluation route twice. Nixon devalued twice, but the problem was he didn't devalue enough, and they kept on deficit spending. So ultimately, we threw in the towel, we closed the gold window, we officially defaulted on our promises, and as a result of that, the government could keep on spending, keep on printing, keep on borrowing. And so that's what happened. And of course, in the 1970s, the dollar lost a lot of value because of that. We had the big run up in the price of oil, skyrocketing gold prices. And then Reagan came in and Volcker came in and kind of put a Band-Aid on that and stopped the hemorrhaging. But now the wound is open again, and probably more blood is going to gush out than ever before. And we are facing a real disaster because of that poor decision that we made. This guy, this economist from, I think, Royal Bank of Scotland, who said, you know, it was smart. It was a good idea for us to have abandoned the gold standard. It was a terrible idea. It was probably one of the worst ideas of all time, and we are paying the price for that bad decision right now. Now, the fact that the Republicans are considering looking at the gold standard, I think it's a great idea. I think it's great that we talk about it, but I think the most important thing that we do this time is we do it. But as I said earlier, I don't even know that we have time to establish a commission and wait for their findings. I think we're going to be in a crisis before we even have a chance to convene that commission. And I think a gold standard is the only thing that makes sense. You see, if you believe in fiat money, if you want to be on a fiat standard, then what you're doing is you're putting your faith and your trust in politicians to do the right thing. Well, who trusts politicians? They've got no integrity. They're not going to do what's right. They're going to do what's politically expedient. They don't care about the country. They care about themselves. They want to get elected. I don't want to put my faith in a politician or a central banker, because they're just politicians too. I want to put my faith in something real. I want to trust exactly what our founding fathers trust. I want to trust money that has been money for thousands of years. Government didn't make gold money. The people made gold money. Governments declared paper to be money, and governments force us to accept it. Nobody has to force you to take gold. People want gold. People want to use it as a medium of exchange. And when gold works, when we have sound money, right, the economy works better. I mean, think about it from this position. How is Ben Bernanke or any one man supposed to know what the right interest rate is or what the quantity of money should be? How does he know? He's just a guy. How's he going to get it right? And the problem is he doesn't even try to get it right. He always tries to keep interest rates too low. He keeps the money supply growing too rapidly because he's thinking about the politics, not the economics. But probably the single most important price in the free market is the price of money, because money represents half of every transaction. And we've got to get that price right, which means it needs to be discovered by the free market. We can't set interest rates the same way the Soviet Union used to set the price of bread, but that's exactly what we do. And the biggest irony, all the people who are coming out saying what a bad idea it would be to go back on a gold standard, the main point that they make is that if we go to a gold standard, then we tie the hands of the Fed. The central bankers can't use monetary policy as a tool to stimulate the economy. And that is precisely why we want to be on a gold standard, because we don't want central bankers manipulating the economy with interest rates. It's not like they've done a good job. I mean, look at the stock market bubble. Look at the internet bubble. Look at the housing bubble. Look at the disasters that we have created because we have given central banks this power. We would be much better off if we take that power away and go back to the Constitution. The Founding Fathers knew what they were talking about. Think about it this way. Would you want your children, let's say your kids who are in high school, would you want them going to a prom without a chaperone? Would you trust high school kids to chaperone themselves? Of course not. Why do we have chaperones at a prom? Well, it's obvious. Because if we put the teenagers in charge of the prom and we tell them, hey, do whatever you want, right? Carte blanche, just, have fun. I mean, can you imagine, right, what's going to happen? We need a chaperone. Well, it's the same thing with politicians, only they're probably worse than drunken teenagers. They need to be chaperoned. They can't be trusted to do the right thing on their own. We need discipline. We need to prevent them from borrowing and spending, and that's what gold does. When you're on a gold standard, there's a limit to how much the government can borrow. These huge and perpetual deficits that we have would be impossible under a gold standard. And that's the real reason that politicians oppose it. Just like why do the high school kids not want chaperones if they could get away with it? Because they're going to have a lot more fun if there's no chaperone. Well, the politicians have a lot more fun without being on a gold standard, because now they can be Santa Claus. Now they can promise something for nothing. They can keep on running deficits. The Fed can keep on monetizing. We can keep on printing money. We can keep on creating inflation. But eventually the whole thing is going to collapse. And we need to go back to sound money. We need to go back to a gold standard. And that is the only way that we're going to get our country back, our prosperity back. It's the only way we're going to rein in the government. So if you believe in small government, limited government, if you don't want deficit spending, if you think we should live beyond our means, if you want to respect the Constitution, right? If you want individual liberty, if you believe in capitalism and all those things, then you got to be for the gold standard. If you're a statist, if you believe in big government, right? If you believe in inflation and central banking, if that's what you believe in, then sure, you're going to oppose a gold standard. I think the fact that the Republicans are now getting that message, and hopefully, or maybe Ron Paul, wing of the Republican Party, is instrumental in moving the needle in that direction, that's great. Well, I guess that about wraps it.